Okay, you're live on camera now.
I will switch. So shall we?
So, all right, so here you go. First presentation. Here you go. AT seminar.
Wait, hello there, class. So we did our PowerPoint on language discrimination in the 21st century. So my father is actually a Portuguese immigrant. He speaks English with a bit of an accent. And one day he was at a meeting, a financial meeting, and he was sitting next to a South African man. Now, the South African man was really intelligent. He had a degree from actually Harvard and MIT. But all the people at the financial meeting were giving him a really hard time because he spoke with a heavy accent. And the man turns to my father and says, "They think that we think with an accent." And pretty much what he was trying to say is that people think that when you speak with an accent, it's like there's something wrong in your head, but there's not. That's not true. And it's just about how when you talk with an accent, people look at you differently, and opportunities are taken away from you when you speak with an accent.
So in the report that I looked up, an experiment was done by Surtani and Salvanathan, having Japanese residents listening to taped conversations of people with a no accent, a mild accent, and heavy accent, and judge their likely personalities of the speakers. And as the graph shows, speakers with heavy accent are generally score lower in all categories on their likely attractiveness to the residents. And above is an evaluation by the participants on likely job status of these speakers. And from the table it is clear that most agree that Japanese native speakers most likely have a higher job status, suggesting the bias towards people without an accent. And from the two sets of data of the reports, the conclusion is that people tend to feel better for native speakers and treat foreign ascendant speakers with a native attitude. And because of their differences in the way they speak, local residents tend to exclude ascendant speakers, which limit the opportunities for them to fit into the society. And thus, the foreign ascendant speakers usually have a harder time being accepted by society due to language discrimination. And this example is quoted from a report titled Higher Education and Children in Immigrant Families. From the information, it's pointed out that Spanish-speaking immigrants in the U.S. have lower percentage of English proficiency, with only 26% compared to the 65% of some Asian immigrants. And relating that information to this table above, it can be interpreted that limited English proficiency is directly related to the chance of receiving higher education. For example, in this case, Latino immigrants from Mexico have particular difficulties in getting a bachelor's degree and making it harder for them to be accepted by the society because of the lack of education and their improficiency in English. So the failure in receiving a higher education causes their inability to improve the economic status and social mobility for these individuals. And their language barrier lead to discrimination as they differ from the rest, and more importantly, limit their opportunities to get a decent job that will help them be treated more equally and not discriminated. From the two examples, the conclusion is that social discrimination occurs because of the difference from the rest of the society, and the main difference between the immigrants and the local resident is language. Therefore, language discrimination takes place and results in a lack of social opportunities as the immigrants are not being accepted.
Okay, so I did language discrimination specifically in economics, and I focused on three main areas. So in economics, it's mainly just people are mainly discriminated against lending money, finding a job, and in public accommodations. So the first one, which is receiving loans. A loan you pretty much need to, if you want to get anything expensive like a house or a car, and what would happen is you pay them with the interest. And when a lot of people who don't speak English that well pay, they end up having higher interest rates than those who speak English. And you might not think that this is a very big problem, but you'd actually be surprised. There's a court case against Ally Bank where they had to pay $18 million for causing higher interest rates for Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians based on their language. And essentially what happens is they have a higher reliance on the business people because they can't speak the language, and the business person in return essentially stabs them in the back and makes them pay more money. And this happens because they don't understand what's going on, so the business person can pretty much just control everything that they do. And they take abuse of the fact that they can't really speak English that well. The second kind is in public accommodations. Now this is, well, when I think of this, I think of civil rights. You know how back then you'd see a separation between like African Americans and white people. It's not to that extent, but it's kind of the same thing. People who speak English get different sorts of services that people who don't speak English as well receive. And so there was a research shown that Mexican families who get medical service for their children receive worse service. And it was like there was a barrier between the people who don't speak English and the people who do speak English, and the people who don't speak English are all alone. And this one happens because they can't communicate. If I was a doctor trying to tell someone, trying to explain to someone what was wrong with them, I wouldn't be able to communicate that well. And sometimes people don't try to communicate with them, which is the problem. The third kind of discrimination would be job discrimination. And the one very specific kind is there's a rule called English only rule. A lot of companies have rules where they only allow people to get a job there if they speak English on the premises. And this includes break times and like calling your children or things like that. You could actually get fired for doing that. And so there's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And what they did was they had a manual about that specifically outlines your rights. And they say how this can actually be done legally. The reason why the English language, English only rule is even allowed is because there's some jobs that require you to only speak English. But the majority of the time that this rule is used, it's actually used illegally, because if a job doesn't require you to speak English, they can't force you to speak English. And people really need to know their rights. But the reason that this one happens is because people are afraid of the unknown. Not hiring people because they don't speak English is essentially like being afraid to go into the ocean because you're afraid of a shark attack. You're not likely going to get attacked by a shark if you go into the water, but you always think that there's that fear. And my conclusion is just that is that your opportunities when you speak a different language are taken away, mostly because there's a communication barrier and that you can't understand other people. And that in reality everything should be equal, but it can't because people are afraid of what they don't understand.
So looking at language discrimination ethically, if you can kind of divide it up into employment. So discrimination in employment is ethically wrong. A lot of employers seek applicants that speak English only, or that speak English as a bilingual language and they can speak well enough to communicate with fellow employees and with customers. A lot of these employees will receive denial when they apply to these positions because they might not speak English well enough to appease the employer. Another situation where this happens is social discrimination, which occurs from language discrimination. If you have employees that speak English not as well as a traditional employee would, they might be discriminated against because they can't communicate with their fellow workers, so thus they're discriminated against because they just don't understand what's going on, and this creates a language barrier. And then when you look at education, the states and the country tends to classify students that are learning English as English language learners, English as a second language students, or limited English proficient students. And these students are qualified differently state to state, and they receive different aid state to state, which can increase language discrimination because not everyone is receiving the same amount of aid when it comes to standardized testing. So talking about standardized tests, students can't answer test questions if they don't understand what the question is asking them. Not understanding the context is different than not understanding what the question is asking. So if a student asks for clarification on the question, that's fine and dandy, but if they don't understand what the question is actually asking them, the context, they can't answer it. This is like the example that Sabrina's mother has of a student that can't answer a question about snow because they've never experienced snow before. So when you look at PARCC testing, the horrible PARCC test, they're changing their requirements for aid, and they're finally allowing the test to be read aloud, dictionaries to be provided, and translated pages. And this is equaling the playing field for these students that are learning English, and it allows them to perform better on these crucial tests, which many need in order to receive financial aid and scholarships like the Abigail Adams Scholarship for the MCAS scores so that they can attend college. The primary case of language discrimination is the Flores versus Arizona case, which happened in 1992. Some ELL students were in a classroom and they received very little aid from the state, and this resulted in very poor performance of these students on tests and in attempting to learn English. The Equal Opportunity Act was violated, and the court ruled that all students must receive the same amount of aid, either in English language learning or standard English, average English classes. So in conclusion, we have to avoid accepting people merely because of their language if they don't speak English as well as we do, or if they speak English with an accent. We can't discriminate them just because of the way that they speak. And we can't avoid people when they're learning English because we all learned English at one point, and that's not something that you can control. So in order to keep America the land of opportunities and dreams, we have to change our attitudes toward immigrants in order to prevent language discrimination.
All right, so the first question will be for Sabrina. How did you handle the differing perspectives in order to reach a conclusion?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. How did you handle the differing perspectives or lenses in order to reach a conclusion?
We kind of look for patterns between each of the lenses. So my lens started with, or my lens specifically showed me how the communication problems. Hers was on education. It kind of showed the same thing, that because they couldn't speak the same language, they didn't get the same opportunity. And it was the whole thing that, like, because they were different, they were somehow less, they were somehow at a disadvantage than everyone else. And we kind of looked for the theme. That was the theme between all three of our lenses.
Good.
All right. All right, this question's for Emily. So how did your research question evolve as you moved through the research process? In other words, did your research go in a different direction than you originally planned or hypothesized?
Only mine or
Everyone in general.
Everyone. Oh yes. We first thought about like language relationship to opportunity, but as we researched, and we came to the conclusion that ours seemed closer to like relate to language discrimination and the effect of language discrimination on people's opportunity, like Sabrina's economic opportunity, mine social, and Nicole's ethic.
Thank you.
Okay, Nicole. How valid and reliable are the sources you use? How do you know which sources didn't work?
I'd say that my sources were relatively reliable because we got to research with you, Mr. Higgins. So in one source particular, it didn't have the bookseller source that I used. It didn't have an author, but I asked you about it and you told me that they were reliable. So I used a lot of like journals and things like that all have reliable sources. I know that both Emily and Sabrina didn't really have as much trouble researching, so they were able to find good sources. I think that kind of helps prove your argument.
Okay, do we want to take just a minute to give some quick feedback to the presentation? Let's have maybe, why don't we say 3 comments? Let's just limit it to that. Anybody have anything to throw out there? Alexis?
At one point, you guys started, well, Nicole was good at saying really, really slow, but you two kind of spoke a little too fast. Allow yourself some breaks, that way we can take in your major points that you were saying instead of speeding through them.
Okay.
I was nervous.
That's why I move around, because it kind of dissipates the nerves.
Common reaction.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
That I wasn't expecting. It was much harder than I thought to like have my cards in my hand and the clicker.
Right.
And so it was like that was something I wasn't expecting. So whoever goes next, like make sure you can do both at the same time. Because I had to ditch,
Differentiate.
I didn't even use these. I had to ditch my cards because I couldn't like.
Oh, so you went without.
Same thing. Ditch
Oh my
cards.
God.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or maybe if someone just do it for you.
Go ahead, Alex.
This isn't really like criticism, it just seemed really long. As far as time, I don't know, maybe when we're up there, it feels short, but I don't know like what the timing was, it just seemed like it was really long. I don't know.
It was about 12 minutes. So they're
Oh, so
yeah, they're in the
it's not-
ballpark here.
So we're
It seemed a lot longer.
I don't know.
That's probably a bad thing.
Guys, mine is shorter than I expected.
Anybody else? One more?
I think
Mine
ours
just
feels
feels
shorter than
shorter.
ours.
Okay.
Speak slowly.
Let's set up for the next one then. So the next presentation. Good job, guys. Matt, Jane, and Allison. Great guys, sit up.